Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The stain above my bed looked like a calendar, but every date marked was someone's last day alive. I'm talking about water damage, the kind that seeps through apartment ceilings and creates those brownish marks that landlords pretend don't exist. But this wasn't just any water stain. This thing had structure, purpose. And once I started connecting the dots, well, let's just say I haven't slept in that bedroom since. You're probably thinking I'm crazy. Maybe I am, but hear me out. Because what I discovered in my cheap Chicago apartment changed everything I thought I knew about coincidence, about fate, about the thin line between the living and the dead. The story begins now. Moving into the Riverside Apartments on North Ashland was supposed to be my fresh start. 26 years old, finally out of my parents' house in Oak Park, ready to make it on my own in the city. The rent was cheap enough for my Target cashier salary, and the neighborhood wasn't terrible. During the day, anyway. The apartment came furnished with the kind of stuff you'd find at a garage sale. Mismatched chairs, a coffee table with 3 good legs, and a bed frame that creaked every time I rolled over. But it was mine. My sanctuary, my escape from the suffocating suburbs where everyone knew everyone else's business. That first night, lying in bed with the streetlights casting shadows through my blinds, I noticed the ceiling stain. It stretched across maybe 3 feet of plaster, directly above where I slept. Brown and yellow edges, like an old map of some forgotten territory. The kind of stain that makes you wonder what happened in the apartment upstairs, and whether you really want to know. I'd dealt with water damage before. My parents' basement flooded every spring, and we'd gotten used to the musty smell and the discolored walls. This felt different, though. More intentional. Like someone had carefully painted these marks, creating something that looked almost organized. Sleep came hard that first week. Every creak of the building, every car door slamming outside, every footstep in the hallway above me, it all seemed amplified. I'd lie there staring at that stain, and I swear it looked different each night. Sometimes it reminded me of Florida, sometimes like a butterfly with torn wings. But then I started seeing the pattern. It happened on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd moved in. I was lying in bed, hitting the snooze button for the 3rd time, when the morning light hit the ceiling just right. The stain wasn't random at all. It was divided into sections. Rectangles, actually. 7 of them, arranged in a row, like the days of a week. And some of those rectangles had smaller marks inside them. Dark spots that looked almost like numbers. I sat up so fast I got dizzy. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and held it up toward the ceiling. The beam illuminated the stain in harsh detail, and what I saw made my stomach drop. It was a calendar. A water-stained, discolored, impossible calendar. The first rectangle on the left had what looked like a 3 inside it. The 3rd one had a 7. The 5th had a 12. And the last one had a 28 that seemed darker than the rest, like it had been traced over and over. I grabbed a pen and notebook from my nightstand, sketching what I saw. 7 rectangles, numbers scattered throughout. It looked like someone had marked specific dates, but dates for what? My hands were shaking as I drew. This was insane. Water damage doesn't create calendars. It doesn't organize itself into neat little rectangles with numbers inside. It's chaos, random, meaningless. But the evidence was right there above my head. I called in sick to work that day. Spent hours lying on my back, studying every inch of that ceiling. The longer I stared, the more details I noticed. Tiny lines that could have been days of the week. Faint marks that might have been additional numbers. And something else. Dates that seemed to shimmer when I wasn't looking directly at them. By evening, I had filled 6 pages with sketches and notes. I'd numbered the rectangles 1 through 7, left to right. I'd traced every mark, every stain, every possible number I could make out. And I'd started to notice something that made my blood run cold. The numbers weren't random, they followed a pattern. The 3 was in the first rectangle, Sunday. The 7 was in the third rectangle, Tuesday. The 12 was in the fifth rectangle, Thursday. And the 28 was in the seventh rectangle, Saturday. It was like someone had marked specific dates on a calendar that existed only in water stains and imagination. But whose calendar? And why were only certain dates marked? That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those numbers floating in the darkness. When I did drift off, I dreamed of calendars with pages that bled, of dates that screamed when you touched them, of time itself dripping through the ceiling like dirty water. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of dripping. The apartment was silent except for that steady drip, drip, drip. I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to scan the ceiling. The stain looked the same, but there was something new. A small puddle had formed on my nightstand right next to my notebook. I touched the water with my finger. It was warm, and it had a metallic taste when I don't know why I tasted it. Some instinct I can't explain. It tasted like copper, like blood. The next morning, I marched straight to the building manager's office. Mrs. Chen had been running the Riverside Apartments for 20 years, according to the faded certificate on her wall. She was the kind of woman who knew everyone's business and wasn't afraid to share it. "Water damage?" she said, not looking up from her crossword puzzle. "Unit 3B always has water damage. Previous tenant complained about it too." Previous tenant? I sat down in the plastic chair across from her desk. "What happened to them?" Mrs. Chen finally looked at me, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Marcus Williams. Nice young man. Worked at the Whole Foods on Clybourne. Moved out about 2 months ago." "Why did he move out?" She shrugged. Didn't say. Just gave his 30 days notice and left. Seemed troubled toward the end. Started asking weird questions about the building's history. My heart started beating faster. What kind of questions? About previous tenants. About deaths in the building. About... She paused, studying my face. About whether anyone had ever died in his apartment. The room felt colder suddenly. And? Had anyone died in 3B? Mrs. Chen went back to her crossword, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. Buildings like this, they see everything. Birth, death, everything in between. I don't keep track of every tragedy, but you remember some. I remember enough. I leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen, I need to know. Has anyone died in my apartment?" She set down her pencil and looked at me with the eyes that had seen too much. "Why are you asking? Are you seeing things too?" "Too? Like Marcus. He started asking questions, started staying up all night. Started talking about patterns in the ceiling." My mouth went dry. "What kind of patterns?" "He said the water stain in his bedroom looked like a calendar. Said it was marking dates. Said it was trying to tell him something." She picked up her pencil again, but her hands were definitely shaking now. 3 weeks later, he was gone. I spent the rest of the day at the Chicago Public Library, hunched over a computer terminal in the local history section. If there was a pattern, if there were dates, maybe there was a record. Maybe there was an explanation that didn't involve supernatural calendars and bleeding ceilings. I started with the obvious searches. Riverside Apartments deaths. 147 North Ashland Avenue fatalities. Chicago apartment building deaths. Nothing. Then I tried the Cook County Public Records. Death certificates, police reports, anything that might mention the building. The search was tedious, but I had nothing but time and growing paranoia. It was around 4 p.m. when I found the first one. Sarah Mitchell, age 34. Died March 3, 2023. Cause of death, accidental overdose. Address, 1247 North Ashland Avenue, Unit 3B. March 3rd, the third day of the month. The 3 in the first rectangle of my ceiling calendar. My hands were shaking as I searched for more. It took another hour, but I found the second one. David Rodriguez, age 28. Died July 7, 2022. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. Address, 1247 North Ashland Avenue, Unit 3B. July 7th, the 7 in the third rectangle. The pattern was real, the calendar was real, and people were dying on the dates marked in my ceiling. I searched frantically for the other dates. The 12 in the 5th rectangle, the 28 in the 7th rectangle. It took hours, but I found them all. Jennifer Walsh, age 45. Died December 12, 2021. Cause of death, apparent suicide. Address, 1247 North Ashland Avenue, Unit 3B. Thomas Chen, age 52. Died October 28, 2020. Cause of death, accidental fall. Address, 1247 North Ashland Avenue, Unit 3B. 4 people, 4 dates, 4 deaths. All in my apartment. All marked on a calendar made of water stains and impossible coincidences. I printed everything: death certificates, police reports, news articles. By the time I left the library, I had a manila folder full of evidence that should have been impossible. But there was something else. Something that made my blood freeze as I walked back to my apartment in the gathering darkness. I'd found records going back 4 years. 4 people dead in 4 years. But Mrs. Chen had said Marcus Williams, the previous tenant, had only moved out 2 months ago. And the building records showed that 3B had been occupied continuously, which meant Marcus had been living in that apartment, sleeping under that ceiling, for months after I'd discovered the pattern. And he'd left suddenly, without explanation. What had he seen that I hadn't? What had made him run? As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I realized I was about to find out. The folder of death certificates sat on my kitchen table like a bomb waiting to go off. I'd been staring at it for an hour, afraid to open it, afraid to see the pattern completed. But I had to know. I had to understand what was happening in my apartment. The first thing I noticed was that all the deaths had happened on different days of the week. Sarah Mitchell died on a Friday. David Rodriguez died on a Thursday. Jennifer Walsh died on a Monday. Thomas Chen died on a Wednesday. But they all corresponded to the marked dates on my ceiling calendar. I spread the papers across my table, creating a timeline. Thomas Chen in 2020. Jennifer Walsh in 2021. David Rodriguez in 2022. Sarah Mitchell in 2023. 1 death per year. All in my apartment. All on dates that were somehow predicted, recorded, marked in advance by water stains that couldn't possibly know the future. Unless they weren't predicting the future. Unless they were recording the past. I grabbed my notebook and went back to the bedroom. Using my phone's flashlight, I studied the ceiling stain again. The calendar was still there, still impossible, still real. But now, I was looking for something else. New marks, new dates, new predictions. It took me 20 minutes to find it. In the second rectangle, the one that corresponded to Monday, there was a faint mark I hadn't noticed before. It was lighter than the others, newer somehow, and it looked like 24. The 24th. A Monday. But which Monday? Which month? I checked my phone. Today was October 15th, 2024. A Tuesday. The next 24th that fell on a Monday was November 24th. 5 weeks away. I stumbled backward, dropping my phone. The light went out, plunging the room into darkness. In the silence, I could hear my heart hammering against my ribs. The calendar wasn't just recording past deaths. It was marking future ones, and November 24th was approaching fast. I spent the next week in a haze of fear and research. I called in sick to work again, told my parents I was fine when they called, and basically lived off coffee and the growing certainty that I was losing my mind. But the evidence kept mounting. I found Marcus Williams on social media. His last post was from August 15th, 2 months ago. Just a simple status update. Finally free. Don't look back. Don't go back. Some places are meant to be left behind. I tried messaging him, but his account was deactivated. I tried calling the Whole Foods where he'd worked, but they said he'd quit without notice and hadn't left a forwarding address. Marcus had discovered the pattern. Marcus had seen the calendar, and Marcus had run, but he'd left me behind to deal with whatever was coming. I started researching the building's history, going back decades. The Riverside Apartments had been built in 1962. For the first 30 years, it had been a respectable middle-class building. Families, young professionals, retirees, normal people living normal lives. Then something changed. Starting in the 1990s, there were more police reports, more ambulance calls, more unexplained deaths, not just in 3B, but throughout the building, like something had awakened. The pattern in my ceiling only went back 4 years, but I started wondering if there were other patterns, other calendars, other apartments with water stains that shouldn't exist. I knocked on my neighbors' doors, asking innocent questions about water damage and ceiling stains. Most people were helpful, even friendly, but a few looked at me like I was asking about something I shouldn't know. Mrs. Patterson in 3A said she'd had water damage for years, but she'd learned to stop looking at it too closely. Mr. Kowalski in 3C said his ceiling stain reminded him of dates he'd rather forget. And the young couple in 3D had just moved in last month, but they'd already started having weird dreams about calendars. The building was full of them. Calendars made of water stains and impossible knowledge. And we were all living under them, waiting for our dates to come up. But I was the only one who'd figured out the pattern, the only one who knew what was coming. November 24th was 3 weeks away. I tried to leave. I really did. I packed a bag, bought a bus ticket to Milwaukee, planned to disappear like Marcus had. But when I got to the door of my apartment, I couldn't turn the key, not because of some supernatural force, not because of ghostly intervention, but because I couldn't abandon the next person who would move into 3B. I couldn't let them discover the calendar without warning. I couldn't let them die on November 24th without knowing what was coming. So I stayed, and I waited, and I watched the calendar count down to my death. 2 weeks. 1 week. 3 days. On November 23rd, the night before the marked date, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, at the calendar that had consumed my life for the past month. The 24 in the second rectangle seemed darker now, more defined, like it was preparing for something. At 3 a.m., I heard footsteps in the apartment above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps that walked from room to room, over and over. But I knew 4B was empty. It had been empty for months. The footsteps stopped directly above my bed, and then I heard the dripping, not from my ceiling this time, from above, from whatever was walking around in the empty apartment upstairs. The dripping got faster, more urgent, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't water dripping down. It was time dripping through the ceiling like blood, like tears, like the dying breath of everyone who had ever lived in this apartment. The calendar wasn't marking deaths, it was counting them down. And tomorrow, November 24th, it would mark mine. November 24th arrived gray and cold, like Chicago mornings in late fall always do. I'd been awake since 3 a.m., sitting in my living room chair, staring at the bedroom doorway, waiting. The dripping had stopped around dawn, but the silence was worse. It felt expectant. hungry. I'd made my choice. I wasn't going to run like Marcus. I wasn't going to leave the next tenant to discover the calendar and face this alone. I was going to stay, and I was going to understand what was really happening in apartment 3B. By 10 a.m., I'd worked up the courage to call Mrs. Chen. "I need to know about the apartment upstairs," I said without preamble. 4B, the one directly above mine. There was a long pause. "Why?" "Because I think someone's been living there. I've been hearing footsteps." Another pause, longer this time. "That's impossible. 4B has been sealed for 3 years. "Sealed? Why?" "Because..." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because that's where it started." "Where what started?" "The deaths, the pattern, the calendar." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "You knew? You knew about the calendar?" "I've been managing this building for 20 years. I've seen things that... Look, can you come down to my office? There are things you need to know before... Before what? Before tonight." Mrs. Chen's office felt different in the harsh fluorescent light. Older, more haunted. She had a bottle of whiskey on her desk, and she poured 2 glasses without asking if I wanted one. "The first death in 4B was my nephew," she said without looking at me. "Thomas Chen, the one who died in 2020. My hand froze halfway to the glass. "Your nephew?" "He was living in 4B, had been for 2 years. Good kid. Worked construction. Sent money home to his parents, but he started changing. Started seeing things. Started talking about patterns in his ceiling. The same pattern that's in my ceiling now?" She nodded. "But his was different, more complete, like a master calendar. He said it showed dates going back decades, deaths that had already happened, deaths that were going to happen." "What did you do?" "I thought he was having a breakdown. Work stress, you know. Construction is hard on the body and the mind. I tried to get him help, but he wouldn't leave the apartment. He said he couldn't leave. He said something was keeping him there." She took a sip of whiskey, her hands shaking. "On October 28th, 2020, I found him at the bottom of the stairs. Broke his neck in the fall. The coroner said it was accidental, but he was found facing upward, like he'd been thrown, and there were marks on his ceiling, fresh marks, like something had been feeding." I felt sick. "What do you mean, feeding?" "After Thomas died, I went into his apartment to clean it out. The ceiling was covered in water stains, but they were organized, deliberate, like a calendar that went back 50 years. Every month, every year, dozens of dates marked. And in the center, a darker stain that looked like what? Like a mouth, like something that opened up to swallow the dates, one by one." I set down my glass. "Mrs. Chen, what is this building?" "I don't know. I've tried to find out, but the records are incomplete. The land has changed hands so many times, been developed and redeveloped. But I think something happened here. Something that left a mark. Something that feeds on what? On time, on the moment of death, on the exact instant when life becomes something else." The room felt colder. "And the calendar in my apartment? I think it's connected to the one in 4B, like a subsidiary, a branch office. The main calendar upstairs marks the deaths, and the smaller calendars downstairs. They help make them happen." "Help how?" "By keeping the victims here, by making them think they can solve the mystery, by making them feel responsible for the next person." She looked at me with eyes full of pity. "By making them stay until their date comes up." I stood up so fast my chair fell over. "I have to get out of here. It's too late. It's November 24th. Your date." "My date? How do you know it's my date?" "Because Thomas told me. Before he died, he said the calendar showed him everything. Past, present, future. He said a young man would move into 3B in October 2024. He said that young man would die on November 24th, 2024. He said that young man would be the last. The last what? The last sacrifice, the last death the building needs to wake up completely. I ran. I ran out of Mrs. Chen's office up the stairs into my apartment. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, my phone. I was getting out of there, pattern or no pattern, destiny or no destiny. But when I reached for the door handle, I stopped, because I could hear it, the dripping, from upstairs, from 4B. And this time, it wasn't just water, it was voices, dozens of them, whispering dates, calling out numbers, reciting the calendar of deaths like a prayer. March 3rd, July 7th, December 12th, October 28th. And then, louder than the rest, November 24th. I looked at my phone. It was 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until midnight. 13 minutes until November 24th was over. 13 minutes until I either lived or died. I sat down on my couch and waited. What else could I do? Run into the street and get hit by a car? Have a heart attack from the stress? Fall down the stairs like Thomas Chen? The calendar had already decided. All I could do was wait. At 11:58, the dripping stopped. At 11:59, the voices went silent. At midnight, nothing happened. I sat there in the darkness, listening to my own breathing, waiting for death to come. But the minutes ticked by, and I remained alive. 12:02, 12:03. November 24th was over, and I was still breathing. I'd beaten the calendar. I'd survived my marked date, but as I sat there in the darkness, feeling relief flood through my body, I heard something that made my blood freeze. New dripping, new voices, new dates being whispered from the ceiling above. And in the bedroom, by the light of my phone, I saw something that made me understand the truth. The calendar had changed. The 24 in the second rectangle was gone, replaced by a darker stain, a satisfied stain, a fed stain. And in the third rectangle, where Tuesday should be, there was a new mark, a new date, December 15th. The day someone new would move into 3B, the day the cycle would begin again. I'm writing this now, 3 weeks later, still living in the apartment, still watching the ceiling. Because I finally understand what Mrs. Chen meant. The calendar doesn't just mark deaths, it marks responsibilities. I'm the caretaker now, the one who watches, the one who waits for the next tenant to discover the pattern. And when they do, when they come to me with questions about water stains and impossible calendars, I'll tell them what I'm telling you now. Some patterns can't be broken. Some cycles can't be stopped. Some calendars count down to more than just death. They count down to forever. The new tenant moves in tomorrow, a young woman named Sarah. She seems nice, normal, hopeful. I wonder if she'll notice the ceiling stain on her first night. I wonder how long it will take her to see the pattern. I wonder what date the calendar will mark for her. But most of all, I wonder if you believe me. If you think this is just a story, just fiction, just the ramblings of someone who's spent too much time staring at water stains and imagining patterns that don't exist. Because if you do, if you think this is just a story, then you're exactly the kind of person who would rent a cheap apartment in Chicago without asking too many questions. You're exactly the kind of person who would ignore water stains and ceiling damage. You're exactly the kind of person who would discover the pattern too late. And if you're that kind of person, well, I have Mrs. Chen's number. She's always looking for new tenants. Just remember to look up at the ceiling on your first night. Just remember to check for patterns. Just remember that some calendars mark more than just days. They mark destinies. What do you think? Are you brave enough to ignore the warning? Are you curious enough to look for the pattern? Are you desperate enough to take the risk? Tell me in the comments what you would do if you found a calendar of deaths on your ceiling. Share this story with someone who needs a warning, and subscribe, because there are more patterns out there, more calendars, more apartments with ceilings that know too much. The next story might be about your address. Sweet dreams. Story number 2. They say be careful what you wish for, but nobody ever tells you to be careful who you wish to. I learned that lesson on a cold October night in Denver, and before you click away, let me tell you something. By the end of this story, you'll never look at a homeless person the same way again. You'll never toss spare change without wondering, what if? What if they're not what they seem? What if they're waiting for you to make that one innocent wish that changes everything? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you exactly what happened, and please, if you've ever encountered someone like this, leave a comment below. I need to know I'm not alone in this. The story begins now. The smell hit me first. Not the usual city smells of exhaust and fast food, but something else. Something like burnt copper and old newspapers. I was walking down 16th Street Mall after my shift at the bookstore, counting the measly tips in my pocket. $43. That's all I had to last until Friday. Rough night? The voice came from a doorway I'd passed 100 times. But tonight, someone was there. A man, maybe 60, maybe older. It was hard to tell beneath the layers of coats and the wild gray beard. His eyes, though. His eyes were wrong. Too bright, too knowing. Yeah, I muttered, not wanting to be rude, but not wanting to engage either. You learn that balance quick in the city. Marcus, he said, and I froze. That's your name, right, Marcus Chen? I hadn't told him my name. My hand went to my wallet instinctively, but it was still there. How did you... I know things. He shifted, and I heard glass bottles clink in his shopping cart. I know you're behind on rent. I know your mom's medical bills are crushing you. I know you lay awake at night wishing for just one break. My mouth went dry. Look, I don't have any... I'm not asking for money. He leaned forward, and that copper smell got stronger. I'm offering to help. One wish, Marcus, whatever you want most in this moment. But you have to ask for it. I should have walked away. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But $43. Mom's chemo treatments. The eviction notice taped to my door. You're crazy, I said, but I didn't move. Am I? He smiled, revealing teeth too white for someone living on the streets. Ask around. People know me. They call me Wishes Walt. Been here, 30 years now. Grant one wish a night to someone who really needs it. And what's the catch? Catch? He laughed. A sound like grinding metal. No catch. You get exactly what you wish for, that's all. I looked at him, really looked. His clothes were worn, but clean. His shopping cart was organized. Not the usual jumble of possessions. And his eyes, God, his eyes seemed to see right through me. This is insane, I said. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. He pulled out a small notebook, its pages yellow with age. You walk by here every night, Marcus. Same route, same defeated shuffle, same wishes you never voice. So voice one. What do you have to lose? Everything. A voice in my head whispered. But louder was the voice reminding me of Mom's face when I told her I couldn't help with this month's treatment. The voice that sounded like my landlord's threats. Fine, I heard myself say. I wish I had enough money to never worry again. Walt's smile widened. Specific, I like that. Very well, Marcus Chen. Your wish is granted. Nothing happened. No flash of light, no magical sensation. Just an old man's knowing smile and that persistent copper smell. That's it? I asked. That's it, check your pocket. I did, expecting to find the same $43. Instead, my fingers touched something else, a lottery ticket. I pulled it out, confused. It wasn't mine. Tomorrow's drawing, Walt said. Mega Millions. $342 million. Those numbers, they're going to hit. How could you possibly? But when I looked up, he was gone. Not walking away gone. Just gone. The doorway was empty except for a lingering whiff of that copper smell. I stood there for 5 minutes, looking around like an idiot. Then I looked at the ticket again. 6 numbers. Nothing special about them, just random digits that supposedly would make me rich. I almost threw it away. Almost, but I kept it. And 3 days later, I was staring at my TV in shock as those exact numbers were drawn. $342 million. After taxes, about $200 million. I was rich. Filthy, impossibly rich. And that's when everything started to go wrong. The money came fast. Faster than I expected. Within a week, I had financial advisors calling, lawyers showing up at my door, and distant relatives I'd never heard of suddenly very interested in reconnecting. But I didn't care. Mom was getting the best treatment money could buy. I'd paid off our debts, bought a house in Cherry Creek. Life was perfect. For about 3 weeks. It started small. I'd wake up at 3:17 a.m. every night, that copper smell filling my bedroom. Just for a second. Just enough to remind me. But remind me of what? I'd won fair and square. The ticket was legitimate. The money was mine. Then came the accidents. First, it was my friend Jake. We'd been close since high school, and I'd given him $50,000 to start his food truck business. He called me, ecstatic, the day he bought the truck. 3 hours later, he was dead. Freak accident. The truck's gas line exploded while he was cleaning it. The investigators couldn't explain it. Never seen anything like it, they said. I told myself it was coincidence, had to be. Then it was my cousin Maria. I'd paid for her daughter's surgery, a heart condition that had plagued her since birth. The surgery was a success. The doctors called it a miracle. 2 days later, Maria's car went off a bridge. They found her at the bottom of the reservoir. The car's electronics had failed. All of them. At once. The pattern became clear after the 4th death. Everyone I helped with the money died. Not immediately, not obviously. But within days of receiving my help, they were gone. Accidents, illnesses, unexplained circumstances. I stopped giving money away. Stopped answering calls, stopped leaving the house, but it didn't matter. Mom lasted the longest. Maybe because I'd wished for her specifically. Maybe because the universe has a sick sense of humor. She made it 2 months. The cancer went into complete remission. The doctors used words like miraculous and unprecedented. She was planning a trip to Spain, something she'd dreamed of her whole life. The night before her flight, I found her in her kitchen. Heart attack, they said. Sudden. Unexpected. No warning signs. At her funeral, I noticed him. Walt, standing at the back of the cemetery, that same knowing smile on his face. I wanted to run at him, to scream, to demand answers. But my legs wouldn't move. After everyone left, he approached me. "Terrible thing. Loss," he said, as if we were old friends catching up. "You did this." My voice was raw. "You killed them." "I didn't kill anyone, Marcus. You did." "What?" He sat on a nearby headstone, casual as could be. "You wished for enough money to never worry again. But worry's what keeps us human. Worry's what keeps us careful. Without it, we make choices. Bad choices. Fatal choices. That doesn't even make sense. Doesn't it?" He pulled out that same yellow notebook. Jake always wanted a food truck, but he was too careful, too worried about the risks. Without worry, he rushed. skipped inspections, ignored warning signs. Maria? Always worried about driving in bad weather. Without that worry, he shrugged. You're saying my money made them careless? Not your money. Your wish. You wanted to never worry again. But worry spreads, Marcus, like a disease, or in this case, like a cure. Everyone you truly cared about, everyone you wanted to help, they caught your fearlessness, your freedom from worry, and without worry, people die, I finished. People die badly, he corrected. Your mother, though, she was different. She worried about you until the very end. That worry kept her alive longer than the others. But even she couldn't resist forever. The moment she truly believed you'd be okay, that she didn't need to worry about her son anymore. I wanted to hit him, to call him a liar, but I remembered Mom's last words to me. I'm not worried about you anymore, Marcus. You're going to be fine. 3 hours later, she was dead. Take it back, I said. The wish, the money. Take it all back. Walt stood, brushing dirt off his coat. Doesn't work that way. You can't unwish a wish, but... He paused, studying me. You could make another one. Another wish? One per customer, typically. But you're special, Marcus. You're suffering in a way I rarely see, so I'll make an exception. One more wish, but choose carefully. My wishes always come true. Exactly as spoken. I thought about it. Really thought about it. What could I wish for that wouldn't backfire? What words could I use that he couldn't twist? I wish, I started, then stopped. No, I need time to think. Time's the one thing money can't buy, Walt said. But I'm patient. When you're ready, you know where to find me. He walked away, and this time I watched him go. He didn't vanish, didn't disappear. Just walked down the cemetery path like any other old man. But I knew better now. I had all the money in the world, and everyone I loved was dead. Be careful what you wish for? No. Be careful who you wish to. I spent weeks crafting the perfect wish. Hired lawyers to help me word it. Consulted with English professors about syntax and meaning. I filled notebooks with possibilities, each one examined for loopholes, for ways Walt could twist my words. I wish for everyone who died because of my first wish to come back to life, healthy and happy, with no negative consequences. Too vague. What defines negative consequences? I wish the effects of my first wish were reversed completely. But then I'd lose the money, and everyone would still be dead. I wish I had never met you. But that might create a paradox. Or worse, it might mean someone else met him instead. Every night, I walked past that doorway on 16th Street. Sometimes Walt was there, reading a newspaper from 1987. Sometimes the alcove was empty. But the copper smell lingered always. Denver got colder. November turned to December. I lived in my Cherry Creek mansion alone, surrounded by everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. The $43 I'd had that night. I kept those bills in a frame, a reminder of when my problems were simple. Then, 2 days before Christmas, something changed. I was walking past the doorway when I heard crying. Not Walt, someone else. A young woman, maybe 25, sitting where Walt usually sat. She had a cardboard sign, stranded, anything helps, God bless. I stopped. I knew I shouldn't, but I stopped. You okay? I asked. She looked up, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Do I look okay? Sorry. I'm sorry. It's been a really bad day, bad year actually. I sat down beside her. Don't ask me why. Maybe I was lonely. Maybe I was tired of being afraid of human connection. Want to talk about it? Her name was Sarah. Lost her job in September. Lost her apartment in October. lost her car in November. Now she was trying to get home to Kansas City for Christmas, but she'd been robbed at the bus station. "All I want," she said, "is to see my daughter. She's staying with my parents. Haven't seen her in 2 months." I reached for my wallet, then stopped. Everyone I'd given money to had died. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing my hesitation. "It's complicated." "Everything's complicated when you're broke," she laughed bitterly. "You know what I keep thinking? If I could just make one wish come true, just one, I'd wish for a way home, that's all. Not money, not a job, just home." The word wish made my blood run cold. "Be careful with wishes," I said. "Why? They don't come true anyway." She pulled her thin jacket tighter. "Sorry, I'm being a downer. You should go, it's getting dark." I stood to leave, then froze. Walt was across the street, watching us, watching her. His smile was different this time. Hungry. "Sarah," I said urgently, "you need to leave now." "What? Why?" "Just trust me. Get up and walk away. Don't look back. Don't come back to this spot." "You're scaring me." "Good. Be scared. Be very scared. But go." She must have heard something in my voice because she grabbed her sign and hurried away. I watched until she turned the corner, then looked back at Walt. He was closer now, close enough that I could see the disappointment in his two bright eyes. "That was rude, Marcus," he said. "I was about to make her Christmas very special. Leave her alone. Or what?" He laughed, that metal grinding sound. "You'll wish at me? Go ahead, make your second wish. I'm curious what you've come up with." I had dozens of carefully worded wishes in my pocket. None of them felt right anymore, because I'd just realized something. Sarah had been about to wish, and Walt had been waiting. "You don't just grant wishes," I said slowly. "You hunt for them." Hunt's a strong word. I prefer collect. Every wish has power, Marcus. Every desperate plea in the dark, every whispered prayer for change. They're all floating out there waiting to be caught. I just give them form, and then twist them. I don't twist anything. I give exactly what's asked for. Not my fault people don't think through their desires. I thought about Sarah, about her simple wish to go home. How would Walt have twisted that? Would home become a coffin? Would she make it there only to find tragedy? The possibilities made me sick. "How many?" I asked. "How many people have you done this to?" He pulled out his notebook, flipping through pages and pages of names. "Started in '93, average one per night except Sundays. I rest on Sundays. So, carry the 4, about 11,000, give or take. 11,000 wishes. 11,000 lives destroyed. Why?" I asked. "What do you get out of it?" For the first time, his smile faltered. "What makes you think I get anything? Maybe I'm just giving people what they want. Free will, Marcus. The greatest gift and the worst curse. But you're not human. Never claimed to be." He tucked the notebook away. "So, ready for wish number 2? Or are you going to keep playing hero, saving every sob story from their heart's desire?" I looked at him, really looked. The bright eyes weren't just knowing, they were old, ancient, tired. "You're trapped too," I realized. "You have to do this. You have to grant wishes." His face went very still. "That's it, isn't it? Someone wished you into existence or cursed you, and now you're stuck, granting twisted wishes forever. You don't know what you're talking about." But I did. It made sense now. The notebook, the routine, the specific rules. He wasn't the master of wishes. He was their slave. "Who was it?" I asked. "Who made the wish that created you?" Walt stood abruptly. "Make your wish or don't, Marcus. But don't presume to understand things beyond your comprehension." He started to walk away. "Wait," I called after him. "I know what I want to wish for." He stopped but didn't turn around. I took a deep breath. This was it. The wish I'd spent weeks crafting. But now, in this moment, I threw it all away. "I wish you were free." The silence stretched between us like a living thing. Slowly, Walt turned around. His face was unreadable. "What did you say?" "You heard me. I wish you were free. From the wishes, from the curse, from whatever's binding you to this existence. Free to rest, free to stop, free to choose." He stared at me for a long moment. Then, for the first time since I'd met him, Walt looked genuinely surprised. "You'd waste your wish on me? It's not a waste if it stops you from hurting anyone else. You don't understand. If I'm free, if I stop, there's no one else. The wishes people make will just float there, ungranted, unfulfilled. Do you have any idea what that kind of desperation does when it has nowhere to go? Then maybe people will learn to stop wishing and start doing." He laughed, but it wasn't his usual grinding sound. It was almost human. "You're either very wise or very foolish, Marcus Chen." "Probably both." "Very well." He straightened, and for a moment I saw him as he might have been once. Just a man. Just someone who'd made or received the wrong wish. "Your wish is granted." This time, there was a flash. Not of light, but of darkness. The copper smell intensified, then vanished completely. Walt stumbled, caught himself, and looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time in decades. He didn't finish. Couldn't finish. Because he was crying. 37 years of wishes and pain, and watching hope turn to horror. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now?" He wiped his eyes with sleeves that suddenly looked more worn, more real. "Now I'm just Walter Henley, 64 years old, homeless, human." He laughed again, and it sounded beautiful, broke, cold, hungry, and free. "The people you helped, or hurt, will they? The wishes can't be undone. What's done is done. Your mother, your friends. I'm sorry, Marcus, truly sorry, but the future." He looked up at the sky. "The future is unwritten now." I reached into my wallet, hesitated. "It's okay," Walter said. "I'm not magic anymore. Your money can't hurt anyone now." I handed him everything I had. About $300. He looked at it like it was a fortune. "Thank you," he said, "for the money, for the freedom, for—" He stopped, looking past me. "Oh no." I turned. Sarah was coming back, approaching from the other direction. She saw us and waved. "Is he bothering you?" she called out, meaning Walter. "No," I said. "He's just—" But the words died in my throat, because I could see it, feel it. The wishes Sarah carried. They were visible now, swirling around her like desperate moths. Without Walt to catch them, to ground them, they were just there, waiting. "What's happening?" Walter asked, seeing my expression. "The wishes," I whispered. "I can see them." Sarah got closer, and the wishes got stronger. Not just hers, others too. Every person walking down 16th Street carried them. Wishes for money, for love, for revenge, for peace. All ungranted, all growing stronger. "Marcus," Walter said urgently, "what did I do? What did we do?" I looked at him, then at Sarah, then at the swirling mass of desperate dreams that filled the air like smog. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think we're about to find out." The wishes were everywhere. Once I could see them, I couldn't stop. They clung to people like shadows, whispered their secrets in colors I didn't have names for. Sarah's wish to go home was a pale blue thread. The businessman rushing past carried a red desire for his wife to love him again. The teenage boy at the bus stop wore his wish for acceptance like a green shroud. "Can you see them?" I asked Walter. He shook his head. "That burden passed to you when you freed me. The wishes need an anchor. Without one." He gestured at the air, which to him must have looked empty. "They'll keep building, growing stronger. Eventually what? I don't know. In 37 years, I never let them accumulate. Never found out what happens when too many wishes occupy the same space." Sarah reached us, smiling despite everything. "You're still here. I felt bad about earlier. You seemed really worried about me." She looked at Walter. "Is this your friend?" "Something like that," I said, distracted by the way her wishes were pulsing, getting brighter. "I'm Walter," he introduced himself. "Just Walter. And you should go home, young lady. It's dangerous out here." "I would if I could," she laughed, but it was hollow. "Like I said, just need a miracle. One tiny miracle." The word miracle made her wishes flare. I stepped back instinctively. "Marcus?" Sarah noticed my reaction. "Are you okay? You look like you're seeing ghosts." "Not ghosts," I muttered. "Wishes." "What?" Before I could explain, it happened. Sarah's wish touched another. A passing woman's desperate desire for her sick son to recover. The two wishes merged, twisted together, and suddenly both women stopped walking. They turned to look at each other, recognition dawning though they'd never met. "My son?" the woman whispered. "Your son?" Sarah asked. Is he in Kansas City?" "Yes, the children's hospital. Leukemia. My daughter's there too. Pneumonia." They stared at each other, and I watched their wishes intertwine further. Blue and gold threads becoming something else, something that hurt to look at. "We could share a ride," the woman said suddenly. "I have a car, but no gas money." "I have $40, Sarah replied. "Just found it. Right here on the ground." There was no money on the ground. I'd been watching, but suddenly there was. 2 20s materialized from nothing but desperate need. "This is bad," Walter breathed. It got worse. The women left together, their joined wishes pulling others along. A man suddenly remembered he had family in Kansas City. A teenager decided tonight was the night to run away there. A bus driver, passing by, felt an overwhelming urge to drive his route off schedule, straight to Kansas City. "They're granting themselves," I said. "The wishes are granting themselves. Without rules, without limits, without the careful twist that keeps them from spreading." Walter grabbed my arm. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. I wasn't just granting wishes. I was containing them, controlling them. One per night, one per person, with consequences that ended their spread. But this, downtown Denver, was changing. I could see it happening. Wishes colliding, merging, creating impossible solutions. A homeless veteran suddenly found a winning lottery ticket. The same numbers I'd won. A single mother discovered her eviction notice had transformed into a deed of ownership. A drug dealer decided to give away his entire stash and go to rehab. It should have been beautiful, people getting what they wanted, what they needed. But the wishes weren't careful, weren't thoughtful. The lottery ticket was stolen from evidence lockup by a wish-infected cop. The deed was forged by reality itself, erasing the actual owner from existence. The drug dealer's stash appeared in the hands of children, their parents' wishes for quick money overriding everything else. "We have to stop this," I said. "How?" Walter asked. "You freed me. I can't gather wishes anymore, can't control them. But I could see them, and if I could see them, teach me," I said. "Teach me how to grant wishes." Walter's face went pale. "No, you don't understand what you're asking. To become what I was, it's not life, Marcus. It's servitude, eternal servitude. Then give me the short version, just enough to stop this before it spreads beyond Denver. He looked at the chaos building around us. More people were stopping, their wishes visibly connecting. A network of desire growing exponentially. Fine, he said. But God forgive me for this. The lesson was simple in concept, horrifying in practice. To grant a wish, you had to take it into yourself. Accept it, shape it, release it with intention. But taking in someone else's deepest desire, it was like swallowing fire. Each wish burned with the person's pain, their need, their desperation. Start small, Walter instructed. That child there, his wish is simple. He wants his toy back. I focused on the boy, maybe 6 years old, crying as his mother dragged him past. His wish was a tiny silver thread. I reached for it. Not with my hand, but with whatever part of me could see it. The moment I touched it, I felt everything. His love for the toy. A stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanuts, lost at the park. His mother too tired, too broke, too overwhelmed to go back for it. I shaped the wish, carefully, precisely. Mr. Peanuts would be in the boy's backpack when he got home. Not stolen from another child, not materialized from nothing. The janitor at the park would find it, clean it, and bring it to their apartment, remembering the boy from earlier. Good, Walter said as the wish left me, properly granted. But you can't do this for all of them. There are too many. He was right. For every wish I carefully granted, 10 more bloomed. The network was growing, feeding on itself. And worse, I could feel something else, something vast and hungry, drawn by the accumulation of so much desperate desire. Walter, I said, what happened to the wishes from before you started? The ones from before 1993? His face told me everything. Oh God, I breathed. There's something else out there, something that feeds on wishes. I was chosen to prevent that, Walter admitted. To keep wishes managed, controlled, limited. One person's tragedy at a time instead of the world's tragedy all at once. The air above Denver was starting to shimmer. Not with heat, but with possibility. With change. With the weight of 11,000 nights of prevented apocalypse. I made a decision. Sarah, I called out, but she was gone. In her place, dozens of people stood frozen, their wishes tangling into a knot of pure need that was starting to pulse with its own life. You have to take it back, Walter said urgently. The wish you made. You have to take back my freedom. I can't. You said wishes can't be undone. Not undone. But you could wish me back into service. Wish me to be what I was. No. I looked at him, really looked. At the man, not the monster he'd been forced to become. There has to be another way. The shimmer above was getting stronger, shapes moving within it. Hungry things that had waited decades for a feast like this. And then I understood. I need to make a wish, I said. Marcus, no. You've seen what wishes do. Not to you. To myself. I took a breath, feeling the weight of all those desperate dreams pressing down. I wish... But how do you word something like this? How do you craft a wish that doesn't destroy everything in its fulfillment? The shapes above were becoming clearer. Things that weren't quite real but were becoming more solid with each uncontrolled wish below. I had seconds, maybe less. I wish to become the guardian of wishes. Not their grantor, not their slave, but their shepherd. To guide them, and protect others from them. To maintain the balance between hope and consequence. Forever, if necessary. This is my wish, freely made, with full knowledge of its weight. The world exploded into copper-scented light. When my vision cleared, I was standing in the same spot, but everything was different. I could see not just the wishes, but the connections between them. The a delicate web of cause and effect. The hungry things above were fading, starved of the chaos they'd come to feed on. "Marcus?" Walter's voice was distant. "What did you do?" "What needed to be done," I said, and my voice sounded strange, older, deeper. "The wishes need management, but not the way you did it, not through twisted gifts and cruel lessons." I reached out, gathering the tangled wishes around me. Sarah's wish to go home, the mother's wish for her son's health, the businessman's wish for love. I didn't grant them, didn't twist them. Instead, I guided them, showed them paths. The businessman would find the courage to talk to his wife. Sarah would discover a legitimate charity that helped stranded travelers. The mother would learn about a new treatment program, not magical, but real. "You're teaching them to grant their own wishes," Walter said, understanding dawning. "When possible, and when not..." I focused on a darker wish, someone's desire for revenge. "I'll carry those, dilute them, transform them into something less destructive." It would be endless work every night walking these streets, gathering the desperate dreams of humanity, not granting them but guiding them, being the shepherd, not the wolf. "This is still a curse," Walter warned. "You're still bound. Maybe, but it's my choice." I looked at him. "You're free, Walter. Stay free. Live. Be human. Let me carry this." He nodded slowly, understanding. Then, without another word, he walked away. Just an old man heading toward whatever life awaited him. I stood there as the sun set over Denver, feeling the weight of every wish in the city. Tomorrow, there would be more. And the day after. And the day after that. But tonight, I had work to do. The copper smell was gone now, replaced by something else. Something like hope mixed with responsibility. I started walking, following the brightest wishes, ready to begin my eternal task. If you've made it this far, you need to know something. I'm still out there, every city, every night. Look for the person who seems to see too much, who shows up just when you're about to make a desperate wish, who asks you, "What do you really want?" I'm not there to grant your wish. I'm there to help you grant it yourself. But be careful. Be so very careful. Because wishes have power. And power without wisdom, that's how monsters are made. Whether they're the monsters who grant wishes, or the ones who make them. But wait. There's one more thing you need to know. One more piece of this story that changes everything. 6 months have passed since that night. 6 months of walking every city, every street, every desperate corner where wishes gather like moths to flame. And in that time, I've learned something that should terrify you. You see, I thought I was unique. The only one who could see wishes after Walter passed his curse to me. But I was wrong. So very, very wrong. Last week in Chicago, I met another shepherd. Her name was Claire, and she'd been doing this for 70 years. 70 years. She looked 25. Time moves different when you're carrying wishes, she told me over coffee that tasted like regret. Every wish you guide ages you a minute. Every wish you absorb to prevent disaster ages you an hour. But every wish that gets fulfilled the right way gives you a day back. "How many of us are there?" I asked. She laughed, but it wasn't funny. "Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, walking among you, invisible, managing the desperate dreams of humanity. We're everywhere, Marcus. We have to be." Why didn't Walter tell me? Because Walter was different. He was punishment, not protection. Someone wished him into existence as revenge, and he became trapped in that role. But the rest of us, we chose this, or it chose us. Same difference in the end. She showed me her notebook. Not yellow like Walter's, but silver, with names that glowed faintly in the dark. every shepherd keeps records, every wish guided, every disaster prevented. It's how we know we're making a difference. And if we stop, remember what almost happened in Denver? That happens everywhere, all at once. The hungry things that feed on uncontrolled wishes, they're always waiting. We're the only thing standing between humanity and its own desperate desires. But here's the part that should really scare you. Claire told me how new shepherds are chosen. It's not random, she said. The universe, or whatever controls this, it watches, looks for people who make specific kinds of wishes. Selfless wishes, wishes that put others before themselves, wishes made with full knowledge of the cost. My blood ran cold. Like wishing for someone else's freedom. Exactly like that. The moment you made that wish, you marked yourself. The universe said, here's someone who understands sacrifice. Here's someone who can carry this burden. So, anyone who makes a selfless wish becomes a candidate. Not all are chosen, but all are watched. And when a shepherd falls, gives up, or finally finds peace, the universe picks from its list of candidates. I thought about everyone listening to this story. Everyone who's ever made a wish for someone else's happiness, someone else's health, someone else's freedom. You're on the list now. You might have been on it for years without knowing. How do you know if you're chosen? I asked. Claire smiled sadly. You'll see your first wish manifest. Not your own, someone else's. A stranger's desperate dream will suddenly become visible, usually at your moment of greatest empathy. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The choice comes after, do you help, or do you pretend it's not there? Everyone chooses to help. Everyone who becomes a shepherd does. The ones who don't, well, they go mad eventually. Seeing all that need and doing nothing, it breaks people. I've thought about that conversation every night since. About you, listening to this. About the wishes you've made. About the moment that might be coming when you'll see someone's desperate dream floating above their head like a neon sign. And I've realized something else. This story? It's not just a warning, it's a test. Because right now, as you listen, some of you are making wishes. Wishing this was just fiction. Wishing you could help people like Marcus helped. Wishing you could make a difference. And a very small number of you, you're wishing you could take this burden from me. You're thinking, if I could carry some of those wishes, help guide them, maybe this person could rest. To those people, I have a message. Stop. Stop right now. That selfless impulse, that desire to help, it's exactly what the universe is looking for. Unless you're ready. Unless you understand that once you see the wishes, you're bound to them forever. Unless you're prepared to walk the earth endlessly, aging and not aging, helping and hurting, carrying the weight of human desire on your shoulders. But if you're ready, if you've already made that wish, then you should know that tomorrow, or next week or next month, you're going to see something impossible. Someone's wish made visible, and in that moment, you'll have a choice. Help them find their own way to their dream, or let the wish float away unguided, where the hungry things can feed. Choose wisely, because once you start, there's no going back. Trust me, I know. Claire told me one last thing before she left Chicago. Every shepherd eventually finds their replacement, someone they guide to the role. You'll know when you meet them, they'll have that look, like they can almost see the wishes already. I've been watching you all, through stories, through screens, through the collective unconscious that connects every desperate dream. And some of you have that look. Sweet dreams, future shepherds. And remember, some of us are listening when you whisper in the dark. Make sure what you're asking for is what you really want, because you just might find a way to get it. And if you do, I'll see you out there, walking the night, carrying the wishes, saving the world one desperate dream at a time. The question is, are you ready for that responsibility? Leave a comment if you've ever seen something you couldn't explain. A wish coming true in an impossible way. A stranger who knew exactly what you needed. A moment where reality bent just a little to accommodate someone's desperate need. Those weren't coincidences. Those were us. And maybe, just maybe, one day, it'll be you.
Story number 3.
Last night, I found something that made my blood run cold. My daughter's favorite teacher, Mrs. Henderson, the one who's been teaching 3rd grade at Maplewood Elementary for supposedly 15 years, doesn't exist in a single yearbook. Not from this year. Not from last year. Not from any year. And when I called the school this morning, they had no record of her either. But here's the thing that's keeping me awake. My daughter still talks to her every single day. If you think you know where this is going, trust me, you don't. Because what I discovered next will change everything you think you know about the people we trust with our children. But before I tell you what happened, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because by the end of this story, you're going to have questions. Questions that need answers. And those answers? They're coming in my next video. The story starts now. The whole thing began 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday night. Nothing special about it. Just your typical suburban evening in Cedar Falls, Iowa. I was helping my 8-year-old daughter Emma with her homework when she mentioned something that made me pause. Mrs. Henderson says I'm getting really good at cursive writing, Emma said, carefully forming the letter Q with her purple gel pen. She showed me how to make the tail curl just right. I smiled, watching her concentrate. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Mrs. Henderson sounds like a great teacher. She's the best, Emma beamed. She's been teaching for 15 years, you know. She told us all about how the school used to look different when she first started. 15 years. That detail stuck with me for some reason. Maybe it was the way Emma said it, with such certainty. Or maybe it was because I'd grown up in this same town, and something about that timeline felt off. Later that evening, after Emma had gone to bed, I found myself thinking about Mrs. Henderson. Emma had started 3rd grade at Maplewood Elementary just 2 months ago, and she talked about this teacher constantly. Mrs. Henderson this, Mrs. Henderson that. The woman had clearly made quite an impression. But here's the strange part. I'd never met her. Now, I know what you're thinking. Not every parent meets every teacher, especially early in the school year. But I'm involved. I volunteer for field trips. I attend PTA meetings. I show up for conferences. I know most of the staff at Maplewood. Yet, somehow, Mrs. Henderson remained this mysterious figure who only existed in Emma's daily stories. That night, I decided to look her up in Emma's school directory. Simple enough, right? Just wanted to put a face to the name, maybe send a thank you email for being so encouraging with Emma's writing. I flipped through the directory twice. No Mrs. Henderson listed under 3rd grade teachers. In fact, according to the directory, Emma's teacher was listed as Mrs. Patricia Collins, but Emma had never mentioned anyone by that name. I figured it was just an error in the directory. These things happen. Schools are notorious for outdated paperwork. So I decided to check the school's website instead. The faculty page showed 3 3rd grade teachers, Mrs. Collins, Mr. Rodriguez, and Mrs. Kim. No Mrs. Henderson anywhere. That's when I felt the first little flutter of unease. Nothing dramatic. Just that subtle wrongness you feel when something doesn't quite add up. Like when you walk into a room and forget why you went there. Except this feeling lingered. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was a substitute teacher, or maybe she worked part-time and wasn't listed on the main faculty page. These things happen all the time in underfunded school districts, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning, I drove Emma to school like always. As we pulled up to the familiar brick building with its cheerful yellow doors, I made a decision. "Hey, Emma, which classroom is Mrs. Henderson's? I'd love to stop by and introduce myself." Emma pointed to the second window from the left on the ground floor. "Room 3B, Mom, but she might be busy setting up for our science experiment today." Room 3B. I made a mental note as Emma skipped toward the entrance, her backpack bouncing behind her. After dropping her off, instead of heading straight to work, I parked across the street and watched the building. Call it intuition, call it paranoia. But I needed to see Mrs. Henderson for myself. I waited for 20 minutes. Teachers came and went through the main entrance. I recognized several of them from school events, but no one went in or out of room 3B. Finally, I worked up the courage to walk into the school. The hallways smelled like disinfectant and construction paper, exactly like schools are supposed to smell. I found room 3B easily enough. The nameplate by the door read Mrs. P. Collins, Grade 3. Through the window in the door, I could see a classroom full of 8-year-olds, including Emma. She was sitting in the front row, raising her hand enthusiastically. At the front of the class stood a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and a floral dress. This had to be Mrs. Collins. But Emma was looking at her with the same adoration she always showed when talking about Mrs. Henderson. I watched for a few more minutes, feeling increasingly confused. The woman teaching the class was clearly experienced, clearly caring, but she didn't match any of the descriptions Emma had given me of Mrs. Henderson. Emma had described her teacher as having long gray hair that she wore in a bun, always dressed in cardigans, with kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. This woman looked nothing like that. I left the school more puzzled than ever. There had to be a logical explanation, but for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what it was. That evening, I decided to approach this systematically. If Mrs. Henderson had been teaching at Maplewood for 15 years, there would be records, yearbooks, newspaper articles, something. I started with the most recent yearbook, which I'd bought just last year when my neighbor's daughter graduated from 5th grade. I flipped to the faculty section and scanned every face carefully. No Mrs. Henderson, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Maybe she'd been sick on picture day, or maybe she'd started after the yearbook was printed. I needed more yearbooks. The next day, I called 3 other parents I knew who had kids at Maplewood. "Hey, this might sound weird, but do you have any old yearbooks from the school? I'm trying to put together a little scrapbook project." Within 2 days, I had collected yearbooks going back 8 years. I spread them across my dining room table like some kind of conspiracy theorist and began my search. Year after year, page after page, no Mrs. Henderson. Not in the faculty photos, not in the classroom pictures. Not even mentioned in any of the dedications or thank you sections where beloved teachers usually got special recognition. It was like she didn't exist. But here's what really started to freak me out. Emma continued to come home with stories about Mrs. Henderson every single day. Detailed stories. Stories about lessons, about conversations, about little moments that felt too specific to be imaginary. Mrs. Henderson brought her cat photos to class today, Emma told me over dinner on Thursday. Her cat's name is Whiskers, and he's orange with white paws. She says he likes to sit on her lesson plans while she's grading papers. Mrs. Henderson taught us about the different types of clouds, Emma said on Friday. She said when she was little, she used to lie in the grass behind her grandmother's house and make up stories about what the clouds looked like. These weren't vague, childish fantasies. These were detailed, consistent narratives about a person who seemed to have a complete life and personality. By Saturday, I was starting to question my own sanity. Was I missing something obvious? Was there some reasonable explanation that I just wasn't seeing? I decided to take a different approach. I would go straight to the source. On Monday morning, after dropping Emma off, I walked directly to the main office. The secretary, Mrs. Yang, greeted me with a warm smile. "Hi there. how can I help you today? I was hoping to get some contact information for my daughter's teacher, Mrs. Henderson. I'd like to set up a conference to discuss Emma's progress. Mrs. Yang's smile faltered slightly. She looked confused. I'm sorry, which grade is your daughter in? 3rd grade, Emma Morrison. She's in Mrs. Henderson's class. Mrs. Yang turned to her computer and began typing. I could see her scrolling through what appeared to be class rosters. After a moment, she looked back at me with a puzzled expression. I show Emma Morrison in Mrs. Collins' 3rd grade class, room 3B. There's no Mrs. Henderson listed in our faculty directory. My heart began to beat faster. Are you sure? Maybe she's a substitute, or maybe she goes by a different name officially. Mrs. Yang checked again. Her brow furrowed. No, I'm not seeing anyone by that name. We have 3 3rd grade teachers this year. Patricia Collins, Miguel Rodriguez, and Jennifer Kim. That's it. The room felt like it was tilting slightly. Has there ever been a Mrs. Henderson who worked here? Maybe in previous years? Mrs. Yang was being patient, but I could see she thought I was a bit odd. She pulled out a thick binder that appeared to contain staff records going back several years. Let me check. She flipped through page after page. No, I'm not seeing any Henderson in our employment records going back to, well, this binder goes back 15 years, and there's definitely no Mrs. Henderson. 15 years. The exact amount of time Emma had said Mrs. Henderson had been teaching at the school. I thanked Mrs. Yang and left the office, but I didn't leave the school. Instead, I found myself walking down the hallway toward room 3B. I needed to see what was happening in that classroom with my own eyes. The door was closed, but I could hear the murmur of a lesson in progress. I peered through the small window and saw the same scene as before. Mrs. Collins at the front of the class, Emma and her classmates paying attention. But as I watched, something strange happened. Emma turned in her seat and looked directly at an empty corner of the classroom. She smiled and nodded as if someone was speaking to her. Then she turned back to face the front of the room. The empty corner she had been looking at. That's where a teacher might stand if they were moving around the classroom during a lesson. My skin began to crawl. I couldn't concentrate on anything for the rest of the day. That image of Emma nodding to an empty corner kept replaying in my mind. By the time she got home from school, I'd worked myself into a state of barely controlled panic. Emma, sweetheart, I said, trying to keep my voice casual as she unpacked her backpack. Tell me about your day. What did you learn in Mrs. Henderson's class? Oh, it was so cool, Mom. Emma's eyes lit up. Mrs. Henderson taught us about the water cycle, and she showed us this really neat trick with a glass of water and some plastic wrap. She said it's like making rain in miniature. I felt a chill run down my spine. The water cycle was a standard 3rd grade science topic. Emma could easily have learned about it from Mrs. Collins and then, transferred the memory to this fictional Mrs. Henderson. But that didn't explain the level of detail in Emma's stories. It didn't explain the consistency of the character she described. Emma, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer, okay? She nodded, suddenly serious at my tone. When Mrs. Henderson is talking to the class, can the other kids hear her too? Emma looked at me like I'd asked the most ridiculous question in the world. Of course they can, Mom. She's our teacher. And when you look at Mrs. Henderson, what does she look like? I told you before. She has long gray hair that she wears in a bun, and she always wears cardigans. Today, she wore a blue one with little pearl buttons, and she has the kindest blue eyes. This was exactly the same description Emma had given me weeks ago. Every detail consistent. I took a deep breath. Emma, I went to your school today and I looked in your classroom. I only saw Mrs. Collins. Emma's face scrunched up in confusion. Mrs. Collins? Mom, I don't know anyone named Mrs. Collins. The bottom dropped out of my world. Honey, the lady at the front of your classroom, The one teaching you about the water cycle. What's her name?" "Mrs. Henderson," Emma said without hesitation. "Mom, are you feeling okay? You're asking really weird questions." That night, after Emma went to bed, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I called my sister Rachel, who's a child psychologist in Minneapolis. "Rachel, I need to ask you about something, and I need you to promise not to think I'm crazy." "Okay," Rachel's voice was cautious. "What's going on?" I told her everything. The yearbooks, the school records, the empty corner. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Sarah," Rachel said finally, "I need you to listen to me carefully. What you're describing, it could be a few different things. Emma could be creating an imaginary friend and projecting her onto her real teacher. Or what? Or she could be experiencing something that we don't fully understand yet. There have been documented cases of children perceiving things that adults can't. Not hallucinations exactly, but sensitivity to things that exist in ways we haven't figured out how to measure." "Are you telling me you think Mrs. Henderson is a ghost?" "I'm telling you that dismissing it entirely might not be the best approach. Has Emma shown any signs of distress? Any behavioral changes?" I thought about it. No, actually the opposite. She's been happier than I've ever seen her. She loves school. She's excited about learning. Mrs. Henderson seems to be having a really positive effect on her. "Then maybe," Rachel said carefully, "the question isn't whether Mrs. Henderson is real. Maybe the question is whether it matters. But it did matter to me. I needed to know what was happening to my daughter." The next day, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to stay at the school and watch Emma's entire class period. I called in sick to work and told the office I was volunteering for the day. Mrs. Yang seemed surprised to see me again, but she didn't question my story about wanting to observe my daughter's classroom experience. I positioned myself in the hallway where I could see through the window of room 3B without being too obvious about it. The class began normally enough. Mrs. Collins stood at the front of the room, leading the students through their morning routine. But then something extraordinary happened. I watched as Mrs. Collins moved to the right side of the classroom to help a student with a math problem. At the same moment, Emma and several other children turned their attention to the left side of the room, where no one was standing. They were all looking at the same empty space, nodding, smiling, clearly engaged with something. Then Mrs. Collins moved back to the front of the room, and the children's attention shifted back to her. But it wasn't like they were following the same person. It was like they were following two different people who happened to be coordinating their movements perfectly. I watched this pattern repeat throughout the morning. Mrs. Collins would be in one part of the room, and the children would be engaged with someone else entirely in a different part of the room. But here's the thing that made my knees go weak. It wasn't just Emma, it was half the class, maybe more. These children were all seeing Mrs. Henderson. I stayed in that hallway for 3 hours, watching and taking notes like some kind of amateur paranormal investigator. The pattern never varied. Mrs. Collins would teach her lesson, and simultaneously the children would interact with someone else entirely. During lunch break, I approached Mrs. Collins directly. "Excuse me, I'm Emma Morrison's mom. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about her progress." Mrs. Collins smiled warmly. "Of course. Emma's a wonderful student, very engaged, very curious." "I'm glad to hear that. She talks a lot about school at home. She seems particularly fond of, well, she mentions Mrs. Henderson quite a bit." Something flickered across Mrs. Collins' face. Just for a moment, her smile became strained. "Mrs. Henderson? Yes, she describes her as having gray hair, always wearing cardigans. I was wondering if perhaps there's an aide or volunteer who matches that description." Mrs. Collins was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. "Mrs. Morrison, can we speak privately?" She led me to an empty classroom down the hall. Once the door was closed, her entire demeanor changed. "How much do you know about the history of this school?" she asked. "Not much. I grew up here, but I attended the elementary school on the other side of town." Mrs. Collins sat down heavily in one of the tiny student chairs. "There was a teacher here named Margaret Henderson. She taught 3rd grade in this building for 15 years. My heart stopped. Was? She died 7 years ago, cancer. She was beloved by everyone, students, parents, faculty. When she passed, the whole community was devastated. I felt like I couldn't breathe. What did she look like? Long gray hair that she wore in a bun, always wore cardigans, usually in soft colors, blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The description matched Emma's perfectly. "Mrs. Collins," I whispered, "are you telling me that my daughter and her classmates are seeing a dead teacher?" Mrs. Collins looked out the window for a moment. "I'm telling you that every year, about half of my 3rd grade students talk about Mrs. Henderson. They describe her exactly the same way. They tell me about conversations they've had with her, about things she's taught them. And you never reported this, never thought it was concerning." "Concerning?" Mrs. Collins turned back to me. "Mrs. Morrison, the children who see Mrs. Henderson consistently perform better in reading and writing than those who don't. They're more confident, more engaged with learning. They show higher levels of empathy and creativity." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've been teaching here for 12 years. I started 3 years after Mrs. Henderson passed. In all that time, not one child who's mentioned her has ever shown any signs of fear or distress about these interactions. They speak about her the way children speak about their favorite teacher." "Because she is their favorite teacher," I said quietly. Mrs. Collins nodded. "I've learned to work with it. When half the class is paying attention to something I can't see, I adjust my lesson plan accordingly. I've actually found that the children learn better when she's involved." I stared at her. "You're saying you coordinate your teaching with a ghost?" "I'm saying I coordinate my teaching with whatever is helping these children learn and grow. Call it what you want." We sat in silence for a moment. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me. "Why don't all the children see her?" "I don't know," Mrs. Collins admitted. "But I've noticed that the ones who do, they're usually the ones who need extra encouragement. The shy ones, the ones who struggle with confidence, the ones who feel different or left out. It's like she appears to the children who need her most." That night, I had the most difficult conversation of my parenting life. "Emma," I said, sitting on her bed as she got ready for sleep, "I want to talk to you about Mrs. Henderson." Emma's face lit up. "Did you finally get to meet her?" "In a way. Emma, Mrs. Henderson she's special. She's not like other teachers." Emma nodded seriously. "I know. She told me that some people can't see her, but that doesn't mean she's not real." My daughter looked at me with those wise 8-year-old eyes and said, "She told me that she stays because she loves teaching and because there are always children who need someone to believe in them." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "And do you need someone to believe in you?" Emma considered this carefully. "I used to feel scared that I wasn't smart enough for 3rd grade, but Mrs. Henderson tells me that I'm exactly smart enough for anything I want to do." The next few days brought a strange kind of peace to our house. I stopped questioning Emma's stories about Mrs. Henderson. Instead, I found myself listening with new understanding when she talked about their conversations. "Mrs. Henderson used to have a daughter, too," Emma told me over breakfast one morning. "She said her daughter grew up to be a teacher, just like her, but she lives far away now, in a place called Oregon." I nearly choked on my coffee. Later that day, curiosity got the better of me. and I did something I probably shouldn't have. I looked up Margaret Henderson's obituary online. The obituary mentioned that she was survived by her daughter, Catherine Henderson Walsh, who taught elementary school in Portland, Oregon. The level of detail in Emma's stories wasn't just consistent, it was accurate. She was somehow accessing real information about a woman who had died before Emma was even born. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed insane to me just weeks earlier. I sat down at my computer and wrote an email to Catherine Henderson Walsh in Portland. Dear Ms. Henderson Walsh, this may sound strange, but I believe my daughter has been communicating with your mother at Maplewood Elementary. I know how this sounds, but I wondered if we could speak. I hesitated for 20 minutes before hitting send. 3 days later, I received a reply that made my hands shake. Dear Sarah, your email doesn't sound strange at all. I've received similar messages from parents at Maplewood over the years. My mother always said that teaching was more than just a job. It was a calling that transcended everything else. I'd love to hear Emma's stories. My mother would be so proud to know she's still helping children learn and grow. That's when I understood. Mrs. Henderson wasn't haunting the school. She was helping it. It's been 3 months since I learned the truth about Mrs. Henderson. Emma is thriving in school, more confident and curious than I've ever seen her. She still talks about Mrs. Henderson every day, and I no longer try to rationalize it away. But here's what's keeping me awake tonight. Yesterday, Emma came home with a drawing. It shows her classroom, with Mrs. Collins at the front and all the students at their desks. But in the corner, drawn in careful detail, is a woman with gray hair and a bun wearing a blue cardigan. At the bottom of the paper, in Emma's neat handwriting, it says, Mrs. Henderson wants to meet you. And when I looked at that drawing, I could swear I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Just for a moment. A figure standing in the doorway of Emma's room, watching us with kind blue eyes. I think Mrs. Henderson has been waiting for me to understand. I think tomorrow I'm finally going to see her. But that's a story for another night. If you want to know what happened when I finally met Mrs. Henderson face to face, you need to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what she told me about Emma, about the other children, about why some teachers never really leave, it changes everything. And if you've ever had a child who talked about an imaginary friend at school, if you've ever felt that strange feeling that someone was watching over your family, leave a comment below. Because after what I've learned, I'm starting to think none of these experiences are as imaginary as we believed. The next part of this story drops next week. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. Next part of the story. The next morning, I walked into Maplewood Elementary with Emma's drawing clutched in my sweaty palm. Mrs. Yang barely looked up as I signed in, muttering something about frequent visitor. This time, I didn't hide in the hallway. I knocked on room 3B's door. Mrs. Collins, I was wondering if I could observe the class again. Emma mentioned something about meeting Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Collins' expression shifted to understanding. She nodded and gestured toward a chair in the back corner, the same corner where Emma had drawn the gray-haired figure. As the morning progressed, I watched the familiar pattern unfold. Mrs. Collins teaching on one side, the children responding to something invisible on the other. But this time, I focused differently. Instead of trying to see with my eyes, I tried to feel with my heart. And then, sometime around 10:30 a.m., it happened. The air in the corner grew warm, like sunlight through a window, though no sun reached that spot. A gentle presence settled beside me, and I heard a voice, not with my ears, but somewhere deeper. You must be Emma's mother. I turned slowly. There she was. Exactly as Emma had described. Gray hair in a neat bun, wire-rimmed glasses, a soft blue cardigan. Her eyes held the kind of warmth that only comes from decades of loving children. Mrs. Henderson, I whispered. She smiled. "I've been waiting to meet you, Sarah. Emma speaks of you constantly. I don't understand how this is possible." "Does it matter how?" she asked gently. "What matters is that it is, and that it helps." I watched as she moved toward Emma's desk, placing what appeared to be a translucent hand on my daughter's shoulder as Emma struggled with a math problem. Emma's face immediately brightened with understanding. "Why Emma?" I asked. "Why these particular children?" Mrs. Henderson returned to sit beside me. Children see the world differently than adults. They haven't learned yet that certain things are impossible, and some children— She paused, looking at Emma with infinite tenderness. "Some children carry a little more magic in their hearts. Magic, compassion, imagination, the ability to believe that love doesn't end when life does." She looked at me directly. "Emma has the gift of seeing beyond the visible world. It's precious, Sarah. Don't let anyone convince her to lose it." Over the next hour, Mrs. Henderson shared stories about her years teaching, about the children she'd loved, about her daughter, Catherine. She spoke about the moment she realized she couldn't leave, not when there were still children who needed encouragement. "I don't haunt this place," she said, echoing my earlier thoughts. "I chose to stay. There's a difference." As the school day ended, Mrs. Henderson began to fade slightly, like morning mist. "Will I see you again?" I asked. "Whenever Emma needs me, I'll be here. And now that you can see me," she smiled, "I suspect I'll be helping your family for years to come." That evening, Emma bounced into the kitchen, glowing with excitement. "Mom, Mrs. Henderson said you finally met her. What did you think?" I knelt down to Emma's level. "I think she's exactly what you said she was. A very special teacher who loves her students very much." "She told me something else too," Emma said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She said that when I grow up, if I become a teacher like her, she'll teach me how to help children the way she does." I felt tears in my eyes. "And would you like that?" Emma nodded solemnly. "I want to help kids who feel scared or different, just like she helped me." 6 months have passed since that day. Emma finished 3rd grade with flying colors and hasn't mentioned Mrs. Henderson as much since moving to 4th grade. But sometimes when she's struggling with homework or feeling uncertain about something, I'll catch her having quiet conversations with empty air. And sometimes, just sometimes, I feel that warm presence in our house, reminding me that love, real love, transcends everything we think we know about the world. Emma still wants to be a teacher. She says Mrs. Henderson is going to teach her all the important things that aren't in textbooks. Things like how to see which children need extra kindness, how to believe in students who don't believe in themselves, and how to love so deeply that not even death can stop you from caring. I used to think the world was made only of things we could touch and see and prove. Now I know better. Some of the most real things in this world are invisible. And sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones who never stop teaching, even when their classrooms exist somewhere between heaven and earth. Mrs. Henderson taught me that love doesn't end when life does, and that's a lesson worth believing in. And 3 years later, Emma came home with startling news. "Mom, they're tearing down the old elementary school. They're building a new one." I felt my heart skip. "What about Mrs. Henderson?" Emma, now mature at 11, was thoughtful. "I asked her. She said she's not tied to the building. She's tied to the children who need her." That weekend, I drove to Maplewood Elementary one last time. Yellow tape surrounded the building. As I sat there, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Catherine Henderson Walsh. I'm in town for the weekend. Would you like to meet for coffee?" An hour later, I sat across from a woman who looked remarkably like her mother. The same kind eyes and gentle smile, though her hair was brown instead of gray. "I flew in from Portland when I heard about the demolition," Catherine said. "I wanted to say goodbye to the building where Mom spent so many happy years." Catherine studied my face. "You've seen her, haven't you? Actually seen my mother?" I nodded. 3 years ago. She's remarkable." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Mom was so dedicated to teaching that I used to joke she'd find a way to keep teaching even after death." She paused. "I guess it wasn't really a joke." She showed me a photo on her phone. "This is my classroom in Portland. Last month, one of my students drew this." The drawing showed Catherine's classroom, but in the corner stood a familiar figure. Gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, blue cardigan. "She's in Oregon too?" Apparently, love doesn't recognize geographical boundaries. Catherine smiled through her tears. "That little girl, Sophia, has been struggling with reading. But after she started talking about the nice lady who helps with words, her reading level jumped 2 grades." That evening, Mrs. Collins called me. "Sarah, I'm retiring at the end of this school year. But first, I need to tell you something. I've kept records for 15 years. Every child who sees Mrs. Henderson shows remarkable improvement. 40% better reading comprehension, higher creativity scores, greater empathy. I'm giving these records to the new principal as documentation that something extraordinary has been helping children here." "What happens when the building is gone?" Mrs. Collins chuckled. "I have a feeling Mrs. Henderson will find a way. Love like that doesn't let demolition stop it." She was right. 2 months after demolition, Emma, now in 7th grade, brought news from her former classmates. Tommy Chen's little brother started kindergarten at the new school. Mrs. Henderson told him not to worry about being away from his mom. She'd keep him company until he felt brave enough to make new friends. The new principal, Miss Rodriguez, seemed curious rather than concerned when children mentioned their helper teacher. "These kids describe her consistently," she told me. "Gray hair, glasses, cardigans. They say she's very kind. The children who mention this teacher seem particularly confident and empathetic." Last week, Emma, now 15 and volunteering as a tutor, came home with an incredible story. "There's a little girl named Maria who's new to the country and struggling to belong. She told me a nice lady with gray hair has been helping her practice English during lunch." Emma's voice filled with wonder. "Mom, Maria said Mrs. Henderson speaks to her in perfect Spanish, with no accent. Of course, she would speak Spanish to a frightened child who needed to feel understood." "Mrs. Henderson is still learning too," I said. "Still finding new ways to help." Emma nodded. She told me teaching isn't just about what you know. It's about caring enough to keep learning what your students need. "Mrs. Henderson taught me that the most important lessons can't be found in textbooks. They're found in the quiet moments when someone believes in you, in the gentle encouragement that helps you believe in yourself, in the understanding that love, real, transformative love, is the most powerful teaching tool of all. And that lesson? That's one that will last forever. Thanks for watching this incredible journey with me. Mrs. Henderson taught me that love doesn't end when life does, that some teachers care so deeply they never really stop teaching, even after death." Has your child ever mentioned an imaginary friend at school, or a teacher who seems too good to be true? Share your story in the comments below. These experiences might be more real than we think. If this touched you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories like this one. Stories about the mysteries that surround us every day, the unexplained connections that bind us together, and the magic that happens when we open our hearts to possibilities beyond what we can see. Thanks for watching this incredible journey with me. Mrs. Henderson taught me that love doesn't end when life does, that some teachers care so deeply they never really stop teaching, even after death. Has your child ever mentioned an imaginary friend at school, or a teacher who seems too good to be true? Share your story in the comments below. These experiences might be more real than we think. If this touched you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories like this one. Stories about the mysteries that surround us every day, the unexplained connections that bind us together, and the magic that happens when we open our hearts to possibilities beyond what we can see. Now, listen the whispers and make a decision whether we are going to cooperate with the whispers or we just want to skip them. But actually, no one can skip these whispers. If you walk away from them, they will run towards you until they reach you. They confront you, make you pay, make you suffer the same thing they suffer. There is no escape from them. If you want to escape, help them, so they can have peace, and you also can have it. Help, or you will ask for help soon. So, the end of today's video has arrived. Share your personal horror experiences in the comments. Also, comment the part of the story that you find the most horror and terrifying. If you like this video, leave a like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Also, ring the bell icon so you don't miss the upcoming videos. Remember, don't run from whispers, because they follow you. They know you. They want you to listen, just confront them. Now, sleep well, or should I say, have a haunted night. Now, sleep. Or at least, try to. It's quiet now, too quiet, but not empty. That feeling crawling up your spine, that weight pressing on your chest, that's not your imagination. You're not alone. There's something behind the curtain. You haven't looked, not because you forgot, but because you're afraid to know. You heard the whisper, software wet, wrong. Like breath dragged across broken glass. But you told yourself it was the wind, didn't you? That lie made you feel safe. Temporarily. Let me ask you, does the wind whisper your name? Does the wind tap lightly, again and again, from the same spot, behind the curtain, every night? Does the wind leave scratches on your window that weren't there this morning? Thin, sharp, like claws, like warnings. You don't remember opening the window. You never open the window. But it's unlocked now. You could check, you could stand up, you could walk over and pull the curtain back. But you won't, because you know. You know what's waiting, not because you've seen it, but because you felt it. In the quiet, in the dark. Every time you close your eyes, every time you wake up and your blanket is just slightly moved. Your door slightly cracked. You try to explain it. Your mind wants to explain it. But that whisper, that sound that only comes when you're alone, when everything is still, when the night is at its deepest, that's not a dream, that's a presence. It doesn't want your fear, it wants your attention. It feeds on the moment you doubt yourself. The second you wonder if you heard something, the instant your heart rate rises. That's when it leans closer. It's been patient, watching, learning you like prey. You ever notice it never shows up when the lights are on, when someone's in the room? It waits for the ritual, the brushing of your teeth, the turning off of lights, the last look at your phone, the deep breath just before sleep. That's when it wakes up. That's when it stirs behind the curtain. Sometimes it watches you all night. Sometimes it moves. A shift in the shadow. A faint creak on the floorboards. The sound of fabric sliding over skin. And when you don't check, when you ignore it, that's when it comes closer. Not fast, not loud, just closer. You might feel a cold spot on the bed. You might feel breath on your neck. You might hear a whisper in your ear that sounds almost like your voice. It copies, it mimics, it blends, not to confuse you, to prepare you, because soon it won't need the curtain, it won't need shadows, it will sit beside you, stand behind you, speak through you. You won't even know when it happens. You'll wake up, look in the mirror, and something will be off. Your eyes won't blink quite right, your smile will linger too long. Your reflection will move just a little after you do. And the people around you? They'll say you seem different. Not worse, just not you. But tonight you're still you. Still in control, for now. You could still check. You could still confront it. Pull the curtain back, face it, but deep down, you've already made your choice. You won't. Because you'd rather lie still, let your eyes drift shut, and hope sleep comes quickly. And it will. But what you wake up as might not be the same. Now, if you've made it this far, congratulations. You're not just a viewer, you're part of something bigger. Something that watches with you, that sits beside you as you watch, as you listen, as you wait. Because this story doesn't end when the screen fades to black. It follows you into the next room, into your dreams, into your reflection. If you liked this story, like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss the next one, so we don't miss you, and comment below. Tell us the moment you stopped feeling alone. We're watching, we're listening, and we read everything. Now, go ahead, gain the courage to check the dark corners before you sleep. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, sleep well, if you can.